Hello, kings and queens and everything in between. The endless problem that many people have, especially newbies in any role-playing game, is how do I do more damage? And while I already covered endgame tech that give you more damage through better play by optimizing your buffs, I deliberately did not cover the other side, which is of course, builds. I don't think a rocket scientist will need to tell you that building your characters wrong is going to lead to many long battles. But how big of a damage loss is building your characters wrong actually? Building your characters have many different aspects, such as what relic set are you using, how many crit substats, is your light cone leveled, superimpositions, signature light cones, traces. Is there any one of these investment points that people are missing, the reason why you could potentially lose around 25% more damage? Heck, is there even an actual scenario where you can lose out on 100% or 200% more damage by just ignoring what seems like not a lot of stats? Yes, there is. And I'm here today to show you my research on this topic and tell exactly why you, dear viewer, are missing out on tripling your damage. Let's get started with the simulation and calcs that I set for this. This is our complete Dr. Veritas ratio. With reasonable max investment, character level 80, maxed out traces, and level 80's S1 signature light cone. Dr. Ratio is with his free-to-play best with Pela, Ting Yun, with both supports having max traces and Ting Yun being able to cap out her attack buff. The sustain for this test does not matter as they won't be giving him any buffs. Dr. Ratio will have 24 control substats out of 36 maximum, 4 of which is to make him hit 134 speed with speed boots, and 21 of which is for crit rolls that are spread out and balanced to optimize the most damage. He will use his best in slot relic sets, 4-piece Pioneer and Sal Soto. Dr. Ratio will also be using his standard 3-turn alt rotation. As you can see, pretty good damage just for solo simulations. I didn't count the damage from the other two, including Benediction, so this is actually quite lower than reality, but this will be enough to serve as our baseline for this entire experiment. We'll be starting from the least crippling investment loss and go deeper while tracking the estimated damage that keeps going down for every corner cut. Firstly, you lose out on 5% more damage if you don't ascend your light cone to level 70+. This is tiny simply because the light cone passives are much more important typically. You do lose out on base attack, which does affect Ting Yun's buff, but light cone levels don't do much else. Overall, however, this can be the cheapest investment since light cone XP is not terribly uncommon. But let's move on. What if our supports had level 8 traces instead? This results in a 6% damage loss. It is fair to note that I did not count Benediction, so the true number is higher, maybe around 8% or so. We are also using characters that generally are not as reliant from their talent levels as others. For example, Robin fares much worse when her traces aren't maxed out due to her own damage contribution. Ruan Mei also has a res penetration, so her levels matter a lot too. But for now, in this ratio team, the estimated decline is now at 12%. What is the estimated decline, you may ask? Our estimated decline tells us how much we've lost by combining the test scenarios we have gone through, from the DPS loss of not leveling your light cone, and the supports losing trace levels combined. We've lost 12% damage. This is an estimation as some buffs are pretty different to scale, like defense down getting more important the more there is stacked on it, so it's not completely accurate, but as you'll see, it's close enough to our final test. Let's keep going further, shall we? No A6 minor traces at 7% damage loss. Minor traces are these things in the board which cost quite a bit of trace materials. It's fair to note that some characters don't get nearly as much offensive minor traces as ratio, so for others it could be lower or higher. Some supports also trivialize some traces, like with Sparkle for example, losing out on a crit damage trace is not as big of a deal as without Sparkle. We won't be counting this for estimated decline since a simulation later will overlap with this and it would be fairly inaccurate if we include this, but it's a fun fact to explore nonetheless. Next, if you don't have the signature light cone, you lose 11% damage. Ratio is subbing out his signature for S5 Cruise for this comparison. Obviously, not a lot of characters even have a signature light cone, and some characters get buffed more than others, like Blade for example. This is a pretty variable as it can go from up to 15% to as low as like 5%, like for example Boot Hill. So it's nice that coincidentally, ratio is in the middle ground. While this is a sizable loss, it is fair to note that this is possibly the most expensive one to try and cover for. So do keep that in mind that 10% may not actually be that huge for what you're spending it for. Nevertheless, our estimated decline so far is 22% less damage, which is getting pretty spooky. If we put Dr. Ratio's traces at level 8, it results in a 12% damage loss. To typical crit DPS like Ratio, this usually checks out. However, for characters that base off break, they don't lose that much damage from their trace levels being lowered. Break characters are more reliant on their base break damage, which is not really affected by trace levels. Higher attack scaling doesn't do much for them, but for example, if a trace level gets higher ignore defense or res pen for example, then yes, it will be a higher DPS loss. An example of a character that relies on traces is Acheron, while Super Break drivers like Shrey can even get away with just level 6 for the specific team of Super Break. The decline is now at 32%, which means you're losing out on roughly around 50% more damage. Yeah, this is not good, isn't it? Next is the much awaited low crit substats. This assumes that Dr. Ratio lost 10 controlled substats of crit rolls from our 21 standard, which results in an 18% damage loss. Comparatively to break effect rolls, the damage does drop off in a similar amount. Of course, this depends on how much crit a unit innately has. For example, someone with 200% crit has less value for a crit roll than someone with 100%. Considering ratio is on the higher side of self-crit buffs, especially with Pioneer in this case, this can be a lot worse than 18%. Yes, artifact substats really are this important that this alone is a worse damage loss than missing out on a signature light cone and an LC being stuck at level 70. Just for scale. Our decline is now 44%, which means we're losing out on 78% more damage. What if Dr. Ratio is stuck at level 70 unascended? This is a 19% damage loss. DPS level 70 in this case is unascended, meaning no Ascension 6 or any of its minor traces as well as lower base stats. It's worth to note that some A6s are nowhere near as strong as ratios, so in some cases this is lower. However, in some cases this can be much worse, like break-based characters since their break damage is based off level. But a general advisory is to always level your characters due to a lot of other factors like your character being a lot more squishy, and defense of the enemy is actually affected by the attacker, so it is still a sizable loss. We are now well beyond losing out on 100% more damage. Yes, this is very scary. The final and highest damage loss in our test is, drumroll please, no set bonus at a staggering 22% damage loss. Like I said in my substats versus sets video, it's very important to note that while having no set is an incredible damage loss, it can be made up for by substats, and decent 2-piece combinations very rarely end up as a 5% loss over the best in slot. But this is talking no planers and cavern bonuses, which horrifyingly stack into this nightmare that you see on the screen. Keep in mind, Pioneer is a very strong set, thus other characters may not have such a strong set as their best in slot, and have high enough baseline stats enabling to not care as much for set bonuses. So this could be lower, but this could also be way worse. Nevertheless, our estimated decline is now at 65%, meaning that now you have nearly missed out on 200% more damage if you took all of these things together. However, this estimated value, like I said earlier, is not accurate due to defense scaling and other factors. So now we'll have a final test combining all these awful corner cuts together. Our final result is, drumroll once again, come on, a 66% damage loss. Now it is absolutely assuredly over 200% more damage that was missed out on. You've lost out on tripling your damage. This is literally worse than running ratio without any supports at all. Now you might be saying, this is cool and all Wave, but nobody exactly is gonna be doing all of that. They will at least invest into something before they start asking for help. Good point. So we'll make some very common set of investment cuts and see how they stack up against each other. You may have noticed from this entire test that innocuous and small corner cuts eventually cascaded into a lot of lost damage. Allow me to demonstrate some multiple examples of this. What if you take a very small corner cut and left your support traces at level 8 while you haven't unlocked Ratio's minor A6 traces? Sounds reasonable, right? You lose out on 12% more damage, which is worse than full invested supports and Ratio not having his signature light cone at all. Next, let's say that you have a complete Dr. Ratio. You know, you have a signature, except for the fact that you don't have his minor traces from A6, his traces at 8, and his support traces at 8. Every one of these corner cuts result in no more than 10% damage loss. However, it eventually ends up being an estimated 33% damage loss. This is a higher damage loss than not getting Dr. Ratio's signature light cone and losing 10 crit substats. For another example, if we take relic related corner cuts, for example you lost 10 crit subs and no set bonus, we get an estimated 36% damage loss, which is even worse than the last one. All of this to say, small corner cuts together can be so bad to your damage that it can end up being worse than straight up just not choosing to spend your limited resources to roll a 5-star light cone. And while we are only using ratio for our tests, many characters end up faring much worse in these kinds of tests. because Ratio himself has a lot of self buffs that really cushion how bad these damage losses are, and break characters especially get hurt worse once you take away their character levels. So no matter what type of character you are, the right amount and type of corner cuts will really just make things so much worse for you. Now, if you were to ask me what budgets you can make after learning this information, I really don't know. The lowest damage loss is the least expensive one, while the highest damage loss is RNG and dependent on your stamina. There's no other way to say this than just max out your characters, get better relics, and you get more out of that than just pulling a light cone. Even some Eidolons that you pull rarely outperform the damage upgrade that covering these tiny budgets bring. Regardless, this is why you may be losing out on tripling your damage. Very small corner cuts that you have to inspect on your own build to see if there is an actual problem here. The moral lesson of this video, I guess, is that you shouldn't just hyper-focus on one specific part of character investment. You could have legitimately godly relics, but if your trace levels suck, then your damage is also going to tank. You could have maxed out traces across the board for your supports and everything, but if you don't have good relics, then you're still gonna suck at it. You have to really focus on a character and all of the investment points instead of just splitting up everything, right? I hope you like this long-ass video. I tried my best to get back on the math horse, so it took quite a while. If this video helped you understand something wrong about your builds, like and comment below, I guess. Subscribe for more, and I'm out. See ya.